What if the story you were taught about the world's beginning was never the beginning at all? Only the faint echo of something older, stranger, and deliberately buried beneath the layers of time? What if the true turning points in Earth's history were not the obvious ones marked in textbooks, but the silent intervals where the planet seemed to hold its breath, erasing nearly every trace of what came before? Imagine a world ending not once, but repeatedly, each collapse wiping clean the memory of entire ecosystems, entire lineages, entire possibilities, until only fragments remained, scattered like embers from a fire no one remembers lighting, because the real mystery has never been the extinction that left a scar across our planet, nor the recovery that followed in hesitant steps. The real mystery lies in the gaps, the missing chapters where life remade itself in ways we can barely reconstruct, where evolution leapt instead of walked, where ancient landscapes shifted so violently that their stories were ground into silence. These voids are not empty. They are full of everything we cannot see, full of every vanished experiment nature once attempted, full of clues to who we are and why we exist at all. They whisper that history is not a straight line, but a fractured mirror, its missing shards hiding some of the most important truths of our past. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there, and as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. In the official timeline of Earth's past, the end of the dinosaurs is presented as a single catastrophic moment. An asteroid, a firestorm, a darkness that swallowed an age. But when you step back from the polished diagrams and textbook certainty, something unsettling emerges. The event we think of as the conclusion was, in truth, the opening of a vast and silent gulf in planetary memory. A gulf where the world reshaped itself in ways almost invisible to us now. A gulf where entire evolutionary experiments flickered into existence and vanished again before they left anything more permanent than a whisper in stone. If the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous was the punctuation mark, then the Paleocene that followed was the missing chapter, an era written in smudged ink and torn pages where life reorganized itself with such speed and subtlety that the fossil record barely kept up. And it is here, in this blurred interval after the apocalypse, that the first mysteries begin to surface. Picture the planet in the hours after the asteroid strike, skies choked with incandescent dust, forests collapsing into flame, oceans boiling at their edges. But deeper in the timeline, after the firestorms quieted and the searing infrared pulse receded, came a darkness not of destruction but of absence, a darkness where the sun's warmth struggled to reach the ground, where months stretched into years without reliable daylight, where the survivors hid in burrows and beneath roots, waiting for a world they could barely imagine returning. Yet when daylight finally re-emerged, what rose from the ashes was not simply continuity, it was reinvention. In the traditional narrative, the small mammals that endured the impact are portrayed as lucky beneficiaries of an ecological vacancy. But luck alone cannot explain what followed. In the first 100,000 years after the event, an eye blink in geological terms, life diversified at a pace that borders on the uncanny. Species appear in the record fully adapted to niches that did not exist before the extinction, as if evolution had leapt rather than crept. Some mammals doubled or tripled in size in spans so short that the usual models of gradual adaptation strain under their own logic. These changes were not gentle, they were abrupt, and the evidence for them survives only in fragments: isolated teeth, partial skeletons, scattered impressions of creatures that should have left far more trace if their populations had been as widespread as their descendants suggest. What vanished in the transition from the Cretaceous to the Paleocene was not just the dinosaurs. It was clarity. The fossil record collapses into a thin trail of breadcrumbs at the very moment when life should have been most dynamic. Scientists describe this gap in cautious language: poor preservation, sampling bias, taphonomic distortion. But behind those terms is a more unsettling possibility: that the world emerging from the extinction behaved in ways that do not fit neatly into our models, species with no clear ancestors, bursts of complexity followed by inexplicable disappearances, entire branches of the mammal family tree rising and falling without leaving a coherent lineage. It is not merely that fossils are missing, it is that the ones we do find hint at stories much stranger than the neat diagrams allow. Consider the earliest Paleocene forests, landscapes dominated not by towering conifers or vast ancient hardwoods, but by fields of ferns stretching across what once were rich ecosystems. Ferns thrive in the aftermath of devastation. They are nature's first responders, flourishing where everything else has died. Their presence in overwhelming abundance suggests not just local collapse, but global sterilization of plant life. Yet within a geological instant, flowering plants surged to dominance across multiple continents, reshaping ecosystems with a speed that defies ordinary evolutionary pacing. How? Why? The pollinators needed for these plants to flourish, small insects, early birds, should themselves have been reeling from the impact winter. And still the world greened again with startling coordination, as if the biosphere itself were rushing to fill a void too large to remain empty. Into this recovering world came the multituberculates, creatures that by all accounts should have been the dominant mammals for millions of years to come. They were adaptable, abundant, and resilient, surviving from the age of dinosaurs into the early Paleocene. Fossil layers show them thriving, diversifying, radiating into ecological roles, from burrowers to climbers to herbivores capable of navigating the newly flourishing forests. And then, with little warning and no clear cause, they vanish. Their extinction is not gradual. It is sudden. A lineage that survived one of the worst catastrophes in Earth's history disappears during a period of relative stability. What replaced them? Mammal groups that were, at first, marginal and rare, creatures with anatomies still primitive compared to the multituberculates. Yet these newcomers swept the world, their rise as mysterious as their predecessors' fall. It is as if the Paleocene was a staging ground, a kind of evolutionary sorting mechanism, not fully governed by the stepwise processes we expect. Something was driving rapid experimentation, rapid elimination, rapid innovation, and nearly all of it took place in the shadows of a broken geological record. We see the outcomes, but not the process. We see the arrivals, but not the journeys. We see the victories, but not the contenders. And in that absence of detail lies a hint that Earth's recovery from catastrophe might not have been as simple as species adapting to newly open niches. It might have been something more turbulent, more chaotic, more unfamiliar. By the time the Paleocene rolled toward the Eocene, the planet was already drifting toward a new identity. Temperatures rose, rainforests expanded, rivers braided themselves across fertile lowlands. And in this greenhouse world came mammals unlike anything the pre-impact planet had ever known. Early primates leaping through dense canopies, proto-horses the size of terriers navigating soft forest floors, predators with elongated bodies and specialized teeth, as if nature were conducting a vast series of trials. But again, the record is fragmented. The ancestors of many Eocene animals appear suddenly, without clear transitional forms linking them to Paleocene predecessors. The fossils we do have suggest rapid shifts in body type, diet, locomotion, changes that should, in theory, require incremental development over long spans of time. Yet the increments are missing. It is this pattern, the sudden appearance, the sudden disappearance, the evolutionary leaps that seem to outrun the fossil trail, that gives the early Cenozoic its strangely haunted character. It feels as though we are observing the silhouettes of creatures moving behind a curtain, their outlines visible, their movements real, but their details concealed by an absence we cannot penetrate. Not because the evidence never existed, but because the world itself was in such upheaval that it could not hold on to its own history long enough for it to be written in stone. As temperatures continued to climb, the Eocene greenhouse world reached a peak that defies imagination. Palm trees in the Arctic, crocodiles in northern Europe, warm rains falling on continents now locked beneath ice. And through this tropical haze, life continued its restless experimentation. Mammals grew larger, stranger, more specialized. But just as quickly as they adapted, they confronted new pressures: migration of forests, shifting coastlines, volatile climate cycles. The result was a constant churn of forms, a rapid turnover rarely matched in later epochs. And with each turnover came another erasure, another set of missing pages in the story of life. The fossil record from this time behaves almost like a palimpsest, a manuscript written, scraped away, rewritten, and scraped again. Each generation of species leaves a trace, only for that trace to be disrupted by shifting rivers, rising temperatures, changes in soil chemistry, or the relentless march of tropical decay. Organic matter vanished before it had a chance to fossilize. Bones dissolved in acidic soils. Sediments were overturned by storms, roots, and geological pulses that transformed ecosystems faster than they could be preserved. The world was too alive, too mobile, too warm for memory to hold still. Yet the shadows of that forgotten world shape the era that follows. When the Eocene finally gives way to cooling trends, the lush forests retreat, the megafauna shift, and entire groups, creodonts, brontotheres, and other mammalian dynasties, collapse without clear cause. What remains are the lineages that will eventually lead to the familiar mammals of today. But even among these survivors, the fossil trail remains discontinuous. Early horses appear in one layer and reappear millions of years later transformed. Early whales transition from land to water in steps we can infer but not fully trace. Early primates split into paths that lead both toward and away from us, their branches lost in the dense rainforests that swallowed their bones before they could reach the rock record. This is the secret of the early Cenozoic. The closer we look, the more it behaves not like a neatly preserved chapter of Earth's past, but like a shattered mirror reflecting only fragments of the whole. And these fragments do not simply represent missing data. They represent missing realities, creatures, climates, environments, entire worlds that existed long enough to influence everything that came after, yet vanished before they could be captured by stone. To understand this period is to accept that Earth's memory is selective. Catastrophes leave scars, recoveries leave mysteries. And what shapes the world most profoundly is often what leaves the faintest trace. The asteroid strike may have ended the age of dinosaurs, but what followed, the hothouse chaos, the rapid diversification, the experimental surge of mammalian life, set in motion the conditions that would one day lead to primates, apes, and eventually us. But in the spaces where the fossil record falls silent, where the strata thin, where the remains are few and scattered, lie the deepest questions. Did life rebound gradually or explosively? Did forests return through slow succession or sudden expansion? Did mammals evolve steadily or in fits and starts prompted by stresses we no longer have evidence for? These questions linger not because science has failed, but because the planet itself swept away its own trail. The Paleocene and Eocene are not simply chapters lost. They are chapters Earth chose not to preserve. And in that choice lies the greatest mystery of all, that the story of life is not written for us. It is written for itself. And its most transformative moments often unfold in darkness, leaving only traces on the edges for us to decipher millions of years later. If the Paleocene and Eocene were the world's blurred awakening after the darkness of the impact winter, then what followed was the moment the planet drew its first steady breath, a breath that should have been recorded in exquisite detail, yet instead dissolved into one of the longest and most enigmatic voids in the history of life. For nearly 30 million years, from the cooling that closed the Eocene to the expanding grasslands of the late Miocene, Earth moved through a sequence of transformations so profound that they reshaped continents, climates, animal lineages, and the very foundations of the ecosystems we know today. And yet the evidence for these transformations lies scattered like a handful of broken pages torn from a book we desperately need to read. To understand the strange emptiness of this period, you have to imagine the world not as a static globe, but as a restless organism. Continents that once drifted lazily began accelerating, grinding into one another with a violence unmatched since the age of Pangaea. India slammed into Asia, crumpling the crust into the jagged Himalayas. Africa pushed northward, closing the ancient Tethys Sea and forcing up the Alps. Geological uplift swept through vast regions of Africa and Eurasia, tilting landscapes, draining basins, redirecting rivers. These were not slow, gentle reshufflings. These were wrenching adjustments on a scale that would have altered everything living through them. Forests drowned under rising basins, wetlands dried into salt flats, grasslands flickered into existence where canopies once stood. And throughout this transformation, life adapted. But its adaptations are preserved only in fragments, truncated stories etched in the scattered fossils that escaped the violence of time. The Oligocene should have been the world's great clarifying interval, the moment after the greenhouse frenzy of the Eocene, where cooler climates carved stability into ecosystems. Instead, it behaves like a silent corridor, a place where the ancestors of modern mammals should have flourished, diversified, and left behind records as abundant as the bones in a museum. But what we find instead is absence. The primates of the early Oligocene appear suddenly, without clear lineage from the tangled primate families of the Eocene. Early horses leap from one body plan to another, with few intermediates. The early relatives of elephants show up in scattered deposits, but vanish again before their story can be told. The entire era is stitched together from fossils separated by hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of years. It is not evolution we see. It is evolution's afterimage. Imagine watching a thunderstorm through flashes of lightning. You see a tree in one moment, a transformed landscape in the next, but never the motion in between. That is the Oligocene, a world seen only in lightning flashes. And those flashes reveal a planet in the grip of profound change. Cooling temperatures forced tropical forests to retreat towards the equator. New species adapted to open woodlands rather than dense jungles. Predators grew leaner and more specialized, their limbs built for speed rather than stealth. Herbivores developed stronger jaws, more complex teeth, bodies designed for covering long distances in search of patchy vegetation. But the fossils that should document these transitions are agonizingly sparse, as if Earth itself were refusing to preserve the evidence of how life restructured itself under the pressures of global cooling. Then came the Miocene, a period scientists often describe as the dawn of the modern world. Grasslands expanded across continents, transforming ecosystems from vertical forests into horizontal seas of wind-swept blades. This shift fundamentally rewrote the rules of survival. In a forest, you can hide in shadow or canopy. On a grassland, you are exposed. Vision becomes more important than scent. Speed becomes more important than stealth. Social groups grow larger. Predators and prey enter an evolutionary arms race where milliseconds mean life or death. These pressures should have left an extraordinary fossil record. Thousands of transitional forms documenting the step-by-step evolution of running limbs, grazing teeth, cooperative hunting. And indeed, in certain lucky regions like North America's Great Plains, we do find impressive sequences of horse fossils, enough to trace their transformation from tiny forest browsers to large plains runners. But these sites are the exceptions. Across Africa and Eurasia, where much of the world's mammalian evolution actually occurred, the record is shattered. Early apes appear abruptly in the Miocene deposits, creatures with unexpected combinations of traits, neither fully monkey nor fully modern ape. Some had the body plans of climbers but the dental structures of grazers. Others walked with a mix of arboreal and terrestrial features. They appeared across 3 continents, Africa, Europe, Asia, suggesting a radiation of species far broader than most lineages ever achieve. And then, almost as suddenly, many vanish. Their bones do not reappear in younger layers. Their descendants are unclear. Some lineages persist for a few million years before evaporating. Others leave no trace at all. These species are known as ghost lineages, not because they are spectral, but because their existence is undeniable and their history invisible. They are shadows cast by DNA evidence, by the comparative anatomy of surviving primates, by faint striations on ancient teeth. They must have existed. They must have thrived. They must have shaped the evolution of the creatures that eventually became us. But their fossils are gone, erased by time, climate, tectonics, or the simple bad luck of where they lived. Grasslands themselves are partly to blame for this disappearance. Fossilization requires rapid burial, quiet lakes, steady floodplains, calm sediments. Grasslands are the opposite, open, wind-swept, eroding, constantly churned by roots, hooves, and storms. Carcasses decay in days, bones bleach in the sun, shatter and scatter. Entire populations lived and died on these plains, leaving behind almost nothing. Only the rare individuals that collapsed near a flood channel, or those swept into low-lying basins during storms, ever stood a chance of preservation. And even then, time often erased them. Yet the Miocene is also the age when many of the animals we know today, elephants, rhinos, deer, antelope, big cats, first took recognizable form. This should have been a period overflowing with transitional fossils, showing the branching of lineages and the refinement of body structures. But again, what we find are abrupt arrivals, prolonged absences, and then abrupt departures, like performers stepping out of darkness onto a stage, delivering their role, and then disappearing into an unlit backstage where history cannot follow. Among the most mysterious are the early big cats. Genetic evidence suggests lions, tigers, leopards, and jaguars share a common ancestor that lived somewhere between 8 and 10 million years ago. Yet fossils of that pivotal species, the one that would shape predators across much of the planet, are nearly non-existent. The earliest solid remains of lions appear only in the last few million years, leaving a 6 million year gap where hundreds of generations roamed, hunted, reproduced, and died without leaving trace enough for us to identify them with certainty. The same is true for elephants. Their early ancestors were small, pig-like creatures that appeared in Africa, but the transition from these early forms to the massive, tusked giants of later epochs is hazy at best. Dozens of transitional species must have existed. Their bones must have accumulated in floodplains and watering holes. But time, erosion, and geological uplift consumed most of them. What we are left with is a bare skeleton of a story, one that demands links we cannot yet supply. And in this vacancy of knowledge sits one of the most compelling mysteries of all: the rise of the apes that would eventually give birth to humanity. Somewhere in the Miocene, the traits that distinguish apes, upright posture, powerful shoulders, grasping hands, enlarged brains, began to take shape. But the details are missing. Fossils appear in one region, vanish, and reappear thousands of miles away in another region without any intermediates connecting them. Some Miocene apes appear adapted for knuckle walking, others for climbing, others for walking upright on branches, others for life on the ground. The diversity is extraordinary and perplexing. It suggests experimentation on a scale that has few parallels in later epochs, as if nature were testing multiple paths at once. But without the fossils showing the intermediate steps, we are left only with the outcomes, not the story. The absence of these fossils is not merely an inconvenience, it warps our understanding of human origins. We know from genetic evidence that our lineage diverged from other apes sometime between 5 and 7 million years ago. But the Miocene record, covering the millions of years leading up to that pivotal split, is essentially a void. We have fossils of apes that look vaguely like early ancestors, but none that fit neatly into the lineage leading to humans. Every candidate discovered so far has sparked debate and division. Some researchers argue they represent early human forebears. Others claim they are evolutionary side branches. Without the missing fossils, certainty is impossible. This is the paradox. The closer we approach the origins of humanity, the more the fossil record collapses. We see the world clearly through the Eocene, lush, hot, overflowing with strange mammals. Then, as climate cools and ecosystems shift, the record becomes patchy. By the Miocene, it becomes a tangle of faint traces. And by the time the first hominins appear, we are studying the story of our own emergence through a keyhole. But perhaps the strangest aspect of this long interval is not the missing fossils, but the missing events. Major extinctions occurred during these epochs, extinctions that reshaped life on Earth almost as profoundly as the end Cretaceous event. Entire families, creodonts, brontotheres, ancient rhinoceroses, died out. But unlike the neatly defined extinction at the end of the dinosaurs, these extinctions lack clear cause. There is no asteroid, no basalt flood, no sudden volcanic winter. The climate cooled gradually, but not rapidly enough to explain such sweeping losses. Something else must have been driving these disappearances. Something subtle or multifaceted, something that left no obvious signature in the rocks. Perhaps forests thinned faster than species could adapt. Perhaps emerging predators outcompeted the older apex hunters. Perhaps diseases spread through populations weakened by environmental stress. Perhaps the changes in atmosphere and temperature created domino effects that cascaded across ecosystems. But these are hypotheses, educated guesses filling the vacuum of evidence. The real answers remain buried somewhere beneath layers of Earth that have long since been uplifted, eroded, or drowned. The Holocene and Miocene stand as reminders that the world does not preserve its memories evenly. Some epochs are generous, offering us bone beds, articulated skeletons, entire ecosystems frozen in time. Others are stingy, leaving only hints, only silhouettes, only mysteries. But the most consequential moments in the story of life, moments when the world reorganized itself, when lineages rose and fell, when the foundations of modern ecosystems took shape, often lie hidden in the barren layers where fossils are few and time is cruel. And so this long, quiet stretch between the tropical chaos of the Eocene and the dawn of recognizable ecosystems becomes something more than an interval. It becomes a shadowed archive, a place where the answers to many of our deepest evolutionary questions lie concealed behind the veil of geological loss. A place where the ancestors of elephants, horses, cats, whales, and humans walked, lived, and died in landscapes now lost to erosion and tectonic upheaval. A place whose silence is not emptiness, but erasure. What emerges from this silence is not just uncertainty, but a reminder. Life's greatest transformations often occur out of sight. Nature does not evolve for the fossil record. It does not preserve its drafts. And in the absence of those drafts, we are left to interpret the final versions, piecing together the hidden chapters of a world that has always been far stranger, far more dynamic, far more elusive than the diagrams in our textbooks ever admit. If the Oligocene and Miocene left us with the unsettling sense that the world was rearranging itself behind a curtain, then what came next? The Pliocene was the moment that curtain should have lifted. This epoch should have given us clarity. It should have offered a clean bridge between the lush, chaotic Miocene world of experimental ape lineages and the stark, sharpened edges of the Ice Age that followed. Instead, the Pliocene behaves like a half-lit corridor where shapes move but rarely come into focus, where crucial evolutionary steps flicker just beyond reach, where the rise of our own lineage unfolds, not in the authoritative progression we expect, but in a series of gaps, contradictions, and vanishing intermediates. It is here, in this strangely elusive epoch, that the boundary between ancient ecosystems and the world we inhabit today begins to blur. And yet the fossil record, instead of illuminating that transition, fractures into fragments that only deepen the mystery. Picture the world as it entered the Pliocene, global cooling accelerating, continents nearing their modern positions, mountain chains lifting towards the sky in slow motion force. As the African Rift Valley widened and dropped, landscapes fractured into mosaics of woodland, grassland, volcanic plateaus, and river systems. This is the environment that should have produced abundant fossils. Rivers carried sediment through steep chasms, lakes formed and dried, formed again, creating basins perfect for preserving bone. Volcanoes erupted frequently, laying down ash layers capable of capturing and protecting entire ecosystems. And yet, even with all these conditions, what survives from the Pliocene is a thin and uneven representation of the species that lived through it. The Pliocene marks the moment when Earth began preparing itself for the Ice Ages, when seasonal variation sharpened and rainfall patterns swung wider, when dry periods stretched longer and grasses multiplied across the continents. Large herbivores evolved taller teeth to survive the abrasive diet of silica-rich grass. Predators developed leaner builds to chase prey across open plains. Birds expanded into new ecological niches created by the patchwork of savannas and shrinking forests. All of this should appear in the fossil layers as clear sequences, gradual transformations, steady adaptations. But instead, we find leaps, sudden appearances of species fully equipped for new environments, followed by absences where their evolutionary footsteps should be. The Pliocene reads not like a chapter of continuous narrative, but like a set of still frames taken at arbitrary points in time. Consider the earliest known hominins, the first beings who, through some combination of posture, locomotion, and ecological pressure, began transitioning away from the arboreal life their ancestors had followed for millions of years. These species occupy one of the most contentious places in the fossil record. They are indisputably real, yet their relationships to one another are inferred from fragments, jawlines, partial femurs, isolated teeth. From these remnants, scientists attempt to reconstruct the grand turning point in human evolution, the moment bipedalism emerged as a defining trait. But the Pliocene does not give us a clean, linear sequence. It gives us scattered beginnings, competing prototypes, evolutionary experiments that vanished before their purpose could be fully understood. One early hominin species shows curved hand bones suited for climbing, but toes structured for upright walking. Another displays short, powerful arms, indicating life in the trees, but a pelvis subtly reshaped toward bipedal motion. Another appears adapted for grassland life, yet retains a skull more similar to Miocene apes than to later Australopiths. These traits overlap across species, across regions, across time, blurring any attempt at a neat family tree. Instead of one lineage leading steadily toward humanity, the Pliocene presents several branches diverging, overlapping, and sometimes disappearing entirely. Evolution during this time was not a single road. It was an unmarked wilderness. But why this chaotic overlap? Why so many competing forms? The answer lies partly in the world these early hominins inherited, a world where climate change did not simply shift temperatures, but restructured entire ecosystems. Pliocene Africa was no longer the humid, forested world of earlier epochs. Instead, it was a place where forests fragmented into islands of green between growing expanses of savanna. Resources became unpredictable. Fruit-bearing trees shrank in number. Carnivores roamed more freely through open terrain. For primates accustomed to the protection of forest canopies, these changes imposed unprecedented pressures. Survival demanded flexibility, experimentation, and rapid adaptation. In such an environment, bipedalism may have emerged not as a grand innovation, but as a practical compromise. Walking upright allowed early hominins to move more efficiently across open ground, free their hands for carrying food, stand taller to scan for predators. But if this adaptation was advantageous, why do we not see a clear fossil trail documenting its spread? Why do so many hominin species appear to flirt with upright walking while retaining features of an arboreal life? Perhaps the answer is that the transition was not ladder-like, but mosaic. Different populations adopting different degrees of upright posture based on their immediate ecological needs. Some remained tied to the trees, others ventured farther into the grasslands, still others inhabited environments that shifted unpredictably between open and wooded. In such a world, the very idea of a first walker may be misguided. Bipedalism might not have begun as a single event, but as a pattern, a repeated response to recurring ecological pressures. And yet, the Pliocene fossil record captures this only in fragments. The stone, the sediment, the volcanic ash preserve flashes. An ankle bone here, a pelvis there, while the millions of bodies that lived between these moments are lost. Geology plays its part in this loss. Rift Valley landscapes are restless. Rivers shift, lakes evaporate, tectonic plates pull apart and climb over one another. Fossils that might have survived in calmer environments are shattered, scattered, or buried too deeply to retrieve. Erosion strips sediment faster than it accumulates. Volcanic eruptions preserve some moments but obliterate others. The very dynamism that shaped early hominin evolution is the same force that erases its traces. But absence is not the only challenge. The fossils that do survive from the Pliocene often defy expectations. Some show combinations of features so unusual they seem almost experimental. Species with tiny brains, but surprisingly advanced dentition. Creatures with ape-like torsos but human-like feet. Small-bodied lineages with unexpectedly complex tool-related wear on their teeth, suggesting behavior that does not match their morphology. These puzzling combinations imply that behavior may have evolved ahead of anatomy, or that separate populations were evolving similar adaptations independently. Either possibility pushes against the expectation of smooth evolutionary progression. Predators, too, evolved along paths that are not entirely clear. Saber-toothed cats, long-legged hyenas, and early canids appear and disappear across the Pliocene without granting us a well-preserved chain of descent. Their fossils reveal sophisticated hunting adaptations, elongated limbs, reinforced vertebrae, jaw structures optimized for particular killing strategies. But the intermediate steps that led to those adaptations remain concealed. Even the landscapes they hunted on, the early grasslands of Africa, the mixed woodlands of Eurasia, are reconstructed from pollen records and sparse plant impressions rather than robust fossil beds. Meanwhile, the oceans underwent transformations just as dramatic as those on land. Early whales diversified into new ecological niches, some specializing in deep diving, others in filter feeding. Yet the fossil record of these advances is spotty. Jawbones appear without clear ancestors, vertebrae suggest powerful swimmers, but fail to reveal the transitional steps from earlier forms. Marine sediments, though better at preserving fossils than terrestrial environments, were disrupted by ocean currents and sea level changes triggered by global cooling. Many potential fossil sites were buried beneath layers too deep for current excavations. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Pliocene is its role as the prelude to the Pleistocene, the era of ice ages, megafauna, and the emergence of humans as a global force. The Pliocene set the stage for the dramatic climatic cycles that would follow, yet the mechanisms of this transition remain murky. We know that Earth's orbit and axial tilt drove cycles of glaciation and warming. We know volcanic activity and ocean circulation patterns played roles. But the detailed feedback loops, how vegetation shifts influenced climate, how atmospheric compositions fluctuated, how ice sheets grew and retreated, are poorly documented in the fossil record. This lack of clarity clouds our understanding of early human evolution. The pressures that shaped our ancestors, pressures to walk, to think, to use tools, to cooperate, did not arise in a vacuum. They were responses to environmental challenges. But without precise reconstructions of those challenges, we are left interpreting fossils without fully knowing the world in which they lived. A pelvis shaped for bipedalism might reflect savanna expansion, or might reflect the need to navigate mixed woodland terrain. Thick enamel on teeth might indicate a diet of tough roots, or might reflect fallback survival strategies during seasonal shortages. Tool marks on bones might reflect deliberate butchery, or scavenging behavior triggered by scarcity. Even as the Pliocene progressed toward its final million years, the fossil record remains stubbornly incomplete. We begin to see clearer signs of the Australopithecines, the early hominin species that bridge the gap between ancient apes and the earliest members of the genus Homo. And yet, even here, the record is far from complete. Australopithecus afarensis, the species to which the famous Lucy belongs, emerges in the fossil layers with a blend of primitive and advanced features. The pelvis suggests confident, upright walking. The arms suggest strong climbing capability. The foot bones show arches, yet the fingers curve. This mosaic anatomy challenges simple narratives. Did bipedalism evolve in trees, on the ground, through a combination of both? The Pliocene does not answer these questions. It merely poses them more sharply. Other Australopith species, A. africanus, A. barelghazali, or garhi, appear in scattered regions, each offering partial answers but raising new puzzles. Some show large molars adapted for powerful chewing, suggesting diets heavy in fibrous plant matter. Others display more gracile jaws, hinting at varied diets or shifting ecological pressures. Their survival across millions of years suggests adaptability, yet their eventual disappearance before the rise of Homo indicates that adaptability was not enough. But why? Competition? Climate? Behavioral limitations? Again, the fossil record falls silent at the crucial moments. And then, near the close of the Pliocene, the first hints of our own genus appear. Not complete skeletons, not full skulls, just fragments. A jawbone from Ethiopia, dated to around 2.8 million years ago. Pieces of skull from Kenya and Tanzania. Stone tools appearing in layers whose makers remain uncertain. These traces mark the dawn of something new, the emergence of cognitive and behavioral traits that will define the human lineage. But without more fossils, we cannot reconstruct how this transition unfolded. Did tool use spark physical changes? Did dietary shifts enable brain expansion? Did social cooperation drive new forms of survival? We see the results, but not the sequence. This absence does not diminish the importance of the Pliocene. Rather, it amplifies its significance. The epoch stands as a threshold, a place where old worlds faded and new worlds gestated unseen. Our ancestors walked through its landscapes, adapted to its climates, shaped its ecosystems, and were shaped by them in return. But the Pliocene has withheld the details of that journey, leaving us with silhouettes instead of portraits, outlines instead of stories. Yet there is a strange beauty in this silence. It reminds us that evolution is not a process designed for our comprehension. It does not arrange itself neatly for future observers. It unfolds in ways that are at once ordered and chaotic, leaving behind fragments that must be deciphered with imagination as much as with science. The gaps in the Pliocene record are not failures of nature. They are reminders that life is always more complex, more fluid, more adaptive than the snapshots preserved in sediment. And so the Pliocene remains a threshold shrouded in partial memory, a place where the story of life on Earth changed direction, but where the footprints of those who walked that path have mostly faded. It is a landscape haunted not by what we see, but by what we know must have existed but cannot recover. A world where the seeds of humanity were sown, yet where the soil refuses to give up its secrets. By the time the world stepped across the invisible threshold that separates the late Pliocene from the beginning of the Pleistocene, something profound had already been set in motion. Something that would transform not only the landscapes of Earth, but the destiny of every creature walking upon them. It is tempting to think of the Ice Ages simply as a period of cold, a long winter that ebbed and flowed across continents. But the truth is far stranger. The Pleistocene was not a single age. It was a rhythm, a pulse, a planetary heartbeat beating in cycles of ice and thaw. And within those rhythms, entire ecosystems emerged and collapsed, species flourished and vanished, and the human lineage, still fragile, still uncertain, began to shape itself against a backdrop of forces so immense that our small footprints should have been erased. Yet they linger, faint and scattered, defying the silence of the ages. What makes the Pleistocene so haunting is not merely its climatic instability, but the sheer magnitude of what it should have preserved. This is, after all, the epoch in which our ancestors learned to walk with purpose across continents, fashion tools with increasing sophistication, hunt in coordinated groups, and survive in landscapes dominated by animals towering above them. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, cave bears, scimitar-toothed cats. All of this happened in a time frame so recent that many of its creatures persisted until the dawn of recorded history. Yet the record we possess, from fossils to artifacts to preserved sites, is shockingly, incomprehensibly thin. It is as though the world conspired to obscure the very era in which humanity's defining traits were forged. Consider what the Pleistocene climate truly meant. Glaciers thousands of feet thick advanced across the northern hemisphere not once, but dozens of times. Entire forests vanished beneath walls of ice. Rivers were dammed, rerouted, or unleashed in catastrophic floods. Sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet, exposing vast land bridges connecting continents. bridges across which herds and hunters alike migrated. Then the world warmed again. Ice retreated. Seas rose. Coastlines drowned. Everything that had existed along those vanished shores, settlements, migration routes, hunting grounds, was swallowed by the ocean, leaving modern researchers to search through fragmentary remnants on lands that today bear no resemblance to the world of our ancestors. It is here, in this interplay of ice and water, that much of the Pleistocene's mystery resides. The landscapes most favorable to human survival, river valleys, coastal plains, abundant grasslands, were also the ones most susceptible to destruction. When ice advanced, it bulldozed the surface of continents, grinding soil and sediment into fine powder and carrying away any trace of the creatures that once lived there. When ice retreated, meltwater carved new channels and submerged old ones. The interplay between these forces created a world that was constantly writing and erasing its own history, layering memories upon memories until the deeper ones vanished entirely. This is why, despite the vast populations of large mammals that dominated the Pleistocene, complete skeletons of these creatures are rare. Mammoths, for all their size and abundance, are known mostly from scattered bones. Many of their species' family trees remain incomplete, with major gaps where transitional forms should exist. The same is true for the enormous ground sloths of the Americas, the powerful cave lions of Eurasia, and the saber-toothed predators that stalked prey across multiple continents. Their bodies should have been preserved in great numbers, yet the cycles of ice and thaw shattered and dispersed them long before they could be entombed. And what about us, our ancestors, the early members of the genus Homo? Their presence in the Pleistocene should be unmistakable. They used fire, built shelters, crafted stone tools with deliberate skill, and hunted some of the largest animals ever to walk the earth. Yet the physical evidence of their existence is astonishingly sparse. Nearly every Pleistocene hominin species is known from mere fragments, a handful of skull pieces, a few jawbones, isolated teeth. Entire populations spanning tens of thousands of years are represented by fossils that could fit into a small box. So why is the Pleistocene such a blind spot? The answer lies partly in geology, partly in climate, and partly in the shifting behavior of early humans themselves. Fossils do not form easily in open grasslands, where scavengers scatter bones and microbes reduce organic matter to dust within weeks. They do not survive well in the acidic soils of forests, where roots and rainwater dissolve bone. And they do not endure the turbulent violence of glacial advance, where even rocks are crushed into fragments. But there is another layer to this mystery, one that is less often spoken. The places where early humans likely lived, coastlines, are now underwater. During the coldest glacial periods, sea levels dropped dramatically, exposing tens of millions of square miles of habitable land now submerged beneath oceans. These landscapes would have offered the richest resources: fish, shellfish, freshwater estuaries, migratory birds, and stable climates moderated by proximity to the sea. If early humans built permanent settlements anywhere, it was likely along these coasts. Yet almost all of these primeval shorelines lie hundreds of feet beneath modern seas, unreachable to standard archaeological excavation. Every tool, every fire pit, every shelter built during those times may remain there still, locked beneath sediment and salt. The Pleistocene also marks the crucial point where human behavior began to turn from reactive to proactive. Before this epoch, evolution shaped our ancestors largely through physical challenges. In the Pleistocene, behavior began to take precedence. Social bonds strengthened. Cooperative hunting emerged. Groups coordinated movements to track herds over vast distances. The first sparks of culture flickered in the form of symbolic marks on bones, pigments on cave walls, and rituals surrounding the dead. But again, the evidence for these developments is inconsistent and fragmented. Cave systems preserve artwork, but only in regions where the climate has kept them intact. Open-air sites rarely survive. The earliest tools of wood or plant fiber have decayed. Countless innovations are lost to time. Even more puzzling is the pattern of human expansion. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, arose in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, but their spread across the globe did not happen in a single wave. Instead, it occurred in pulses, sudden migrations followed by long periods of stasis. These migrations often coincided with climatic shifts, suggesting that humans moved when conditions forced them. But what triggered these movements? Was it scarcity, curiosity, conflict, or something more complicated, changes in cognition or social organization too subtle to detect in the archaeological record? The fossils do not tell us. They show only that our species moved, adapted, and survived. The reasons remain unrecorded. The Pleistocene also saw the coexistence and eventual disappearance of multiple human species. Neanderthals roamed across Europe and parts of Asia, adapted to cold climates with muscular builds and large nasal passages. Denisovans, known only from scant physical remains but revealed through genetic traces, inhabited vast regions of Asia. Smaller-bodied species like Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis survived on islands well into the late Pleistocene, exhibiting traits that challenge assumptions about brain size and intelligence. And yet, nearly all of these species vanished before the end of the Ice Age. The cause remains debated. Climate change surely played a role, but climate alone cannot explain the suddenness of their disappearance, nor the survival of modern humans. This leads to an unsettling thought. If the Pleistocene was the crucible in which humanity was forged, then it was also the stage on which other human lineages ended, their stories cut short not by catastrophe, but by gradual forces we cannot fully reconstruct. Some researchers argue that modern humans outcompeted these species through innovation. Others contend that interbreeding absorbed them into our gene pool. Still others propose that diseases, cultural conflicts, or subtle environmental changes were to blame. But without a fuller fossil record, these remain possibilities rather than conclusions. And then there is the question of megafaunal extinctions. Across every continent except Africa, large animals vanished rapidly at the end of the Pleistocene. Mammoths, mastodons, giant kangaroos, saber-toothed cats. All disappeared in a geological instant. Their extinction patterns mirror the arrival of modern humans in many regions, suggesting a connection. But the evidence for widespread, systematic hunting sufficient to drive species to extinction is thin. Very thin. Kill sites are rare. Butchery marks are inconsistent. Tools appropriate for taking down massive animals are scarce. If humans caused these extinctions, they must have done so in ways that left little trace. If climate was the cause, why did so many species disappear simultaneously around the world? And if the answer lies somewhere between the two, the exact balance remains hidden. The Pleistocene's mysteries extend beyond animals and artifacts. They reach into the climate record itself. Ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland reveal rapid oscillations, temperature shifts of up to 20 degrees occurring over decades. Such abrupt fluctuations defy the slow, steady models of climate change often taught in schools. These shifts would have reshaped environments dramatically within human lifetimes, forcing migrations, altering food sources, and disrupting established patterns of survival. Yet the archaeological record does not mirror the pace of these transformations. Instead, it seems almost sluggish, offering only occasional glimpses of how humans responded. It is as though the behaviors that allowed our ancestors to endure these upheavals left no physical mark. And so the Pleistocene stands as a paradox. It is recent enough that much should have survived. It is the epoch in which our species emerged, spread, and triumphed. It is the time when the world's great beasts walked beside us, when glaciers carved the continents, when human culture began taking shape. And yet it is also a void, a silence broken only by intermittent and imperfect traces. What we do find challenges many of our assumptions. The oldest stone tools, simple flakes and cores, appear earlier than expected in some regions, hinting that hominin cognition may have advanced sooner than the fossil timeline suggests. Evidence of fire use, once thought to be rare, now appears earlier and more widely. Artifacts hint at symbolic thinking hundreds of thousands of years before the famous cave paintings of Europe. Burial sites suggest a complexity of mind and culture long before the spread of anatomically modern humans. These discoveries, fragmented though they are, suggest that the inner life of hominins was richer, more nuanced, and more modern than once believed. But without more complete evidence, we cannot fully rewrite the story. The Pleistocene asks us to accept that our origins are not carved into stone as clearly as we might hope. They are instead a tapestry woven from what remains and from what is missing. The bones that survived, the tools that did not weather away, the footprints frozen in volcanic ash, the cave walls that remained dry enough to preserve the paintings made by hands long since turned to dust. And in that tapestry, one thread runs consistently: humanity's resilience against glaciers, predators, starvation, shifting climates, and the disappearance of familiar landscapes. Our ancestors endured. The fossil record may be incomplete, but the fact of our existence is not. We are the descendants of those who adapted, who survived, who navigated a world that changed faster than they could understand. Yet the silence of the Pleistocene lingers. It whispers that the world we know rests upon the ruins of worlds we have never seen. That human origins, far from being a straight line, are tangled with branchings and extinctions concealed by time. That the earth remembers only selectively, and that its forgotten memories may be the ones that defined us most. As the last great ice age waned and the world inched toward a climate that resembled our own, something extraordinary and deeply perplexing took place across nearly every continent. The Pleistocene giants, the megafauna that had dominated ecosystems for hundreds of thousands of years, vanished. Not slowly, not gradually, but with an abruptness that defies the calm, linear explanations often offered in textbooks. Entire species, mammoths, mastodons, woolly rhinoceroses, giant ground sloths, cave lions, short-faced bears, dire wolves, Irish elk, collapsed into extinction within a geological instant. Some survived in pockets for several thousand years, but the broader pattern remains. a global wave of disappearance that swept through Earth's ecosystems just as the climate stabilized and just as one species, ours, began to expand with unprecedented speed. It is one of the great riddles of Earth's history. For decades, explanations have been divided into two camps: the climate hypothesis and the human overkill hypothesis. Both offer pieces of the truth, but neither alone can explain what happened. The end of the Ice Age brought warming, yes, but warming had occurred many times before without triggering such a vast extinction event. Humans hunted, yes, but archaeological evidence of widespread megafauna slaughter is shockingly sparse. The pieces do not align into a simple story. Instead, they suggest a far more complex, far more enigmatic tipping point, one that reshaped the entire biosphere and forced humanity into a world no longer shared with creatures that had lived beside our ancestors for tens of thousands of years. To understand this enigma, imagine standing on a grassland in Eurasia 20,000 years ago. The world is cold, but life is abundant. Mammoths move in herds across open plains, their tusks curving toward the sky. Woolly rhinos scrape snow aside to reach tough sedges. Giant deer with antlers spanning wider than a modern car stride between patches of forest. Packs of wolves follow migrating herds. Lions, the size of modern tigers but more powerfully built, wait in ambush near frozen streams. This was not a barren world of ice. It was a thriving ecosystem balanced around cold-adapted species whose survival strategies had been refined over millennia. And yet, within a few thousand years, a blink in deep time, this world collapsed. Fossil layers from the early Holocene show sudden absence. The bones of megafauna vanish from cave floors and riverbeds. Tracks that once etched the mud of melting floodplains disappear. The great Ice Age predators lose their prey and, soon after, disappear themselves. What happened? The first explanation scientists reached for was climate change. As the planet warmed, habitats shifted. Grasslands shrank in some regions, forests expanded in others, and precipitation patterns altered the availability of vegetation. Rapid climatic events, particularly the Younger Dryas, a sudden cold snap followed by abrupt warming, certainly destabilized ecosystems. But climate alone cannot account for the pattern. Many species had survived previous glacial cycles far more extreme than this one. Mammoths, for instance, lived through dozens of climatic oscillations without collapsing. Something different happened at the end of the Pleistocene. Something unprecedented in scope. That something may have been humanity. But here, too, the story is not straightforward. The simplest version of the overkill theory proposes that humans arrived on new continents and hunted megafauna to extinction. The logic seems compelling, but the evidence is thin. On most continents, confirmed kill sites are rare. Weapons suitable for taking down massive animals appear late and inconsistently. And in many areas, megafauna disappeared before clear evidence of human occupation. Yet this does not mean humans played no role. Instead, their influence may have been subtle and systemic. Even low levels of hunting pressure, when combined with climate stress, could have tipped populations into decline. Human use of fire to clear vegetation may have altered habitats. Human presence may have disrupted migration routes. And as human populations expanded, competition with predators may have shifted the balance of power within ecosystems. But these explanations still leave holes. Why did species disappear in regions where human populations were sparse? Why did some megafauna survive thousands of years after warming began, only to vanish abruptly later? Why did extinctions occur almost globally, in environments ranging from tundra to desert to tropical forest? And most curiously, why did Africa, where humans evolved and coexisted with megafauna for the longest period, retain most of its large animals? To answer these puzzles, we must look deeper, not only at fossils but at the gaps between them. The Holocene fossil record, like much of the Pleistocene, is fragmented and uneven. In many areas, sedimentation slowed dramatically after glacial retreat, reducing opportunities for preservation. Forest floors, where many animals would have died, rarely fossilize remains. Floodplains shifted, eroding older deposits. Coasts that once teemed with megafauna were submerged as sea levels rose. When we look at the extinction event through this distorted lens, what appears as sudden disappearance may in fact be a prolonged and complex decline. But even with these considerations, anomalies persist. In Siberia, mammoths survived for thousands of years after the mainland populations disappeared, isolated on Wrangel Island. In the Arctic, a different group continued on St. Paul Island, cut off by rising seas. These isolated populations collapsed not from overhunting, but from genetic bottlenecks and environmental stress. Their survival long past the continental extinctions challenges both climate and overkill theories and suggests that the disappearance of megafauna was not a single event, but a mosaic of events, varying from region to region. Meanwhile, in North America, fossils reveal a strange pattern. Megafaunal populations appear robust right up until the moment they vanish. There is little evidence of prolonged decline. Instead, the end comes swiftly, within a few centuries. Some researchers point to a phenomenon called trophic cascades, a collapse in one species triggering collapse in others. For example, the disappearance of mammoths may have altered vegetation, allowing forests to expand and reducing grasslands. This, in turn, affected herbivores that depended on open environments, which then impacted predators that relied on large herbivore prey. The extinction, viewed this way, becomes an ecological domino effect, not a simple cause and effect relationship. But here we encounter yet another mystery. In several regions, including parts of Siberia and the Great Plains, pollen records indicate that vegetation changed abruptly at the same time megafauna vanished, not before. This suggests the possibility that animals shaped ecosystems more intensely than previously understood, and that their disappearance transformed landscapes almost instantly, not gradually. So which came first, ecosystem collapse or megafaunal extinction? The fossil record cannot answer definitively. It shows patterns, correlations, hints, but not the mechanics behind them. Something large was changing, and evidence of that change is lost in the very sediments that should preserve it. And then we arrive at the most haunting part of the Holocene's beginning, the rise of humanity. Not the scattered, fragile humanity of the earlier Pleistocene, but the humanity that expanded across the globe with accelerating momentum. The humanity that built shelters, shaped landscapes, extinguished predators, and transformed ecosystems. As megafauna vanished, human populations grew. As predators declined, humans became the world's dominant hunter. As climate stabilized, humans learned to manipulate their surroundings in ways no other species could. But the archaeological record of this transformation suffers from the same problem as the fossil record of megafaunal decline. It is incomplete, uneven, distorted. Many early human settlements lay along rivers that shifted courses or flooded, burying evidence. Others were built on coasts now submerged. Stone tools survive, but wooden structures, woven baskets, early clothing, and countless aspects of daily life have vanished. This absence gives rise to a dangerous illusion. The illusion that early Holocene humans lived simple lives. In truth, the gaps in the record conceal behaviors likely far more complex than surviving evidence indicates. They built, crafted, innovated, traded, and adapted. They altered fire regimes, hunted strategically, and migrated in response to shifting ecosystems. They created the first stable societies long before agriculture. But the proof of these behaviors often lies in the faintest traces. Charcoal deposits, stone tool modifications, scattered animal bones bearing cut marks. Among the greatest puzzles of the early Holocene is the timing and nature of the shift to agriculture. Farming appears in the archaeological record in multiple places independently: Mesopotamia, China, Mesoamerica, but the early signs are inconsistent. Domestication does not appear suddenly. It begins subtly, with human selection of certain plants and animals without yet committing to controlled breeding. This process spans thousands of years and is almost invisible archaeologically. The seeds and bones that would document these early stages do not preserve well. And so the earliest chapters of agriculture remain shadows, inferred from later developments. The same is true for early settlements. Permanent villages appear abruptly in some regions, such as the Levant, with structures far more complex than what precedes them. Where are the transitional stages, the first experiments in sedentary life? Where are the temporary camps that would have preceded permanent architecture? Where are the earliest communal spaces? The most likely answer is that they were built with organic materials, wood, fiber, mud, that left little trace. Thus, just as the disappearance of megafauna remains obscured by gaps in the fossil record, the rise of civilization is obscured by gaps in the archaeological record. And in both cases, the result is the same. We confront mysteries where we expect clarity. We confront uncertainty in the very era closest to us. Yet the Holocene's beginnings do not merely challenge our understanding of the past. They also reveal something profound about the nature of resilience. Humanity emerged from this period not because it conquered the world through overwhelming force, but because it adapted to loss. Loss of familiar landscapes, loss of giant animals, loss of predictable seasons. The disappearance of megafauna forced humans to shift their strategies, diversify their diets, refine their tools, and expand their mobility. The changing climate pushed them to explore new lands, innovate new technologies, and form larger, more complex social networks. Every absence in the Holocene record, every missing fossil, every vanished settlement, every unpreserved tool speaks to this pattern of adaptation. We may not see the evidence directly, but the outcomes are visible in the arc of humanity's rise. And it is this arc that defines the final mystery of this transitional age, how a species once scattered and vulnerable became the dominant force on Earth. We stand today on the far end of that transformation, looking back into a darkness where only fragments of light remain. But those fragments tell us enough to know that the Holocene began not with simplicity, but with upheaval. Not with clarity, but with ambiguity. Not with stability, but with a struggle for survival that reshaped both our species and the world around us. By the time humanity stepped firmly into the Middle Holocene, the world should have felt familiar. Warming climates, rising seas, expanding forests, and the first faint outlines of permanent settlement. Yet instead of clarity, this era delivers something far more disquieting, a widening gulf between what must have existed and what remains. It is a period defined not by what we see, but by what we can no longer trace. A period where entire cultural landscapes surged and receded like tides, leaving behind only scattered pottery shards, enigmatic stone alignments, and the faintest whispers of social worlds now vanished. In the official view, the Middle Holocene is portrayed as a gentle ramp toward civilization. But the evidence tells a different, older, stranger story. A story where humanity was already experimenting with complexity long before the major civilizations emerged. And yet almost none of these early experiments survived the erosion of time. Instead, they collapsed into silence, erased by floodplains, swallowed by rising seas, consumed by forests, or buried under the cities of later ages. To understand the depth of this silence, imagine the world between 8,000 and 4,500 years ago. Sea levels were rising so rapidly that coastlines shifted by miles within a few generations. The Sahara was still green, dotted with lakes large enough to sustain fishing villages. Europe sprawled beneath dense forests more ancient than any written tradition. The Amazon was not an untouched wilderness, but a patchwork of modified landscapes shaped by human hands. Rivers across Asia carried sediments through floodplains that destroyed as much evidence as they preserved. In this dynamic world, early human societies were anything but primitive. They were adaptive, ingenious, mobile, and interconnected in ways the archaeological record struggles to reveal. People traveled long distances to trade obsidian, marine shells, botanical dyes, and stone tools. They built communal structures that required coordination and shared belief systems. They manipulated landscapes, diverted rivers, managed forests, and planted crops in ways that showed deliberate planning. But the record of these achievements is often incomplete, not because they did not occur, but because the materials used and the environments inhabited rarely preserved them. This is the tragedy and the mystery of the Middle Holocene. Its achievements lie in perishable forms. Wooden dwellings, reed boats, woven textiles, early scripts scratched onto wood or bark, all vanished. What survives instead are the durable remnants, the stone-built sites that stand like isolated sentinels in a vast archaeological void. Göbekli Tepe, Nabta Playa, Poverty Point, Karal, Seçim, Karnak. Their stones remain, but the societies behind them remain obscure. Consider Göbekli Tepe, a monumental site erected around 11,000 years ago and deliberately buried around 8,000 years ago. Even after decades of excavation, scholars cannot fully explain who built it or why. Its pillars depict animals with astonishing detail: lions, foxes, serpents, vultures, creatures rendered with symbolic importance. The effort required to quarry, move, and carve these stones suggests a level of organization far greater than what small bands of hunter-gatherers should have achieved. Yet no early settlements around the site have been confirmed. It is as if the community that built it lived invisibly, constructed their sacred architecture, and then receded into the forests without leaving anything more. Yet Göbekli Tepe is merely one piece of a global phenomenon. The Middle Holocene features countless early structures that challenge the narrative of slow, linear development. In the Sahara, Stone circles and megalithic alignments mark ancient ceremonial grounds from a time when the desert was a savanna teeming with life. In the Arabian Peninsula, vast geometric earthworks, sometimes called the works of the old men, stretch across thousands of miles, visible only from the sky. Some appear to have been hunting traps, others astronomical markers, and others still defy interpretation entirely. In the Amazon, beneath dense forests, archaeologists discovered geometric earthworks, squares, circles, and interconnected pathways, representing settlements far more complex than the colonial myth of untouched wilderness allowed. Soil analyses reveal terra preta, artificially enriched earth, created through deliberate long-term agricultural practices. These discoveries suggest that the Amazon once hosted large, well-organized populations long before European arrival, but their dwellings, tools, and stories largely perished in the acidic soils. And across northern Europe, long barrows, causewayed enclosures, timber circles, and burial mounds speak of ceremonial practices that predate writing by millennia. Yet the cultures that built them left minimal domestic traces. Villages are ephemeral, easily lost beneath the churn of agriculture or buried under later construction. Even the great Neolithic enclosures of Britain, massive circular structures requiring extraordinary labor, remain partially speculative in purpose. Were they meeting places, ceremonial centers, markers of seasonal gatherings? The lines between settlement, ritual, and social identity blur in ways that resist clear classification. The Middle Holocene also witnessed sweeping migrations that reshaped genetic and linguistic landscapes. The spread of Proto-Indo-European languages, the expansion of Afro-Asiatic-speaking peoples, the dispersal of Austronesian navigators, and the movements of Bantu societies across Africa all began in this enigmatic window. But their origins remain obscured by the absence of written records and the perishable nature of early settlements. We rely on genetic clues, pottery styles, and reconstructed vocabulary, but these offer only glimpses. The motivations for migration, climate change, resource pressure, social competition, spiritual vision, remain partly hidden. As these societies expanded, so too did their mastery of domestication. Dogs had long accompanied humans, but now sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, and various plant species became increasingly integrated into human lifeways. Yet domestication was not a singular moment. It was a slow dance between species. Humans selected animals with favorable traits, while animals adapted to human-controlled environments. Early evidence of this transition, bone morphology changes, genetic markers of selection, exists, but the earliest stages remain nearly invisible. The tools used to contain animals, the enclosures built, the rituals surrounding livestock, all are lost. Meanwhile, in regions where sedentary life took hold, populations grew. With density came specialization. Some people became tool makers, others farmers, others ritual specialists or early political leaders. But these roles did not leave the unmistakable marks of later states. House size varied subtly. Burial goods hinted at hierarchy, but only faintly. Early signs of social stratification emerge, but the mechanisms behind them remain elusive. Did leaders arise through charisma, genealogy, control of resources? The archaeological record offers only partial answers. Trade intensified. Jade traveled from China into Southeast Asia. Obsidian from Anatolia moved across the Levant. Seashells from coastal India appeared deep in the Deccan Plateau. Copper circulated long before bronze casting, traded in ingots, and shaped into symbolic objects. But without texts, the identities of traders, the routes they used, the negotiations they made, all remain speculative. The Middle Holocene world was interconnected, but the map of those connections is only partially recoverable. What is recoverable, however, is the evidence of early conflict. Skeletal remains show healed injuries, embedded arrowheads, and occasionally mass graves with signs of organized violence. But the causes of conflict, land, resources, ideology, are unknown. Fortifications appear in some regions, only to vanish centuries later. Weapon styles evolve. Yet without written accounts, the stories behind these conflicts remain silent. Were they small-scale raids? Prolonged territorial disputes? Clashes between emerging polities? The bones cannot tell us. The Middle Holocene also saw one of the most overlooked yet consequential developments in human history: the invention of long-distance voyaging. Austronesian seafarers, using outriggers and star-based navigation, began journeys across the Pacific that would eventually populate far-flung islands thousands of miles apart. Their earliest boats, navigation tools, and rituals have vanished, but their descendants preserve fragments of knowledge in oral traditions. Their migrations altered ecosystems, introduced new species, and forged cultural links still visible today. But the earliest phase of this remarkable movement remains archaeologically mute. Throughout all of this, climate exerted enormous influence. Around 6,000 years ago, the Holocene climate optimum began to fade. Regions like the Sahara dried. Monsoons weakened. Lakes evaporated. Forests retreated. These shifts triggered migrations, cultural collapses, and reorganizations. Yet the archaeological evidence of these transitions is often fragmentary. In some regions, we have only pollen grains and lake sediments to reconstruct vast cultural upheavals. Entire societies may have abandoned regions without leaving behind anything more than a thin scatter of stone tools. And then, in the final millennium of the Middle Holocene, something remarkable and unsettling appears across multiple continents. Monumental architecture grows in size and sophistication, not just in one place, but globally. Stonehenge, the earliest ziggurats, the precursors to Egyptian pyramids, temple complexes in Peru, ancient road systems in Arabia, circular earthworks in Europe. These structures required labor coordination, resource extraction, specialized knowledge, and political or ritual leadership. Yet the written records that would explain their meanings are absent. We see the monuments, but not the minds that created them. This global rise of monumentalism hints at societies far more organized than the archaeological record reveals. Perhaps they held councils. Perhaps they maintained seasonal rituals. Perhaps certain individuals wielded spiritual or political authority. But the tools of governance, ledgers, tokens, early scripts, have rarely survived. The materials used to communicate decisions, record harvests, or codify rituals were ephemeral. Bark, leather, reed mats, knotted textiles, materials that degrade and vanish, and with them vanishes the intellectual world of early administrators, priests, and planners. This brings us to the crucial point. The silence of the Middle Holocene is not an absence of activity, it is the absence of preservation. The societies of this era were dynamic, innovative, adaptive, and interconnected. But their choices of materials, their landscapes, and the relentless processes of erosion and burial conspired to conceal their earliest chapters. And yet, this silence does not erase the truth of their existence. Instead, it forces us to reconstruct them from fragments that reveal a world far more complex than once imagined. A world where the seeds of later civilizations were already being sown. A world where architecture, trade, agriculture, ritual, navigation, and social hierarchy were already taking shape in thousands of small communities whose names and stories have vanished. The Middle Holocene is not the prologue to civilization. It is civilization's hidden foundation. A foundation built by countless hands whose works did not endure the ages, but whose influence echoes in every later city, every ritual, every organized society. Humanity's story is not one of sudden awakening. It is one of countless forgotten beginnings. And the Middle Holocene, veiled in silence, remains one of its most mysterious turning points. By the time humanity approached the late Holocene, the age just before the first written civilizations illuminated history with words, the world had already been shaped by thousands of years of forgotten labor, unseen migrations, vanished settlements, and silent revolutions. Yet as we step into this period expecting clarity, we instead encounter one of the strangest paradoxes in our entire story. The closer we draw to recorded history, the more the archaeological record behaves as though something is missing. Not merely undiscovered, not merely eroded, but missing in patterns too consistent, too widespread, too eerily synchronized across continents to be dismissed as coincidence. The late Holocene, roughly the window from 4,300 to 3,500 years ago, should have been a crescendo of visibility. Agriculture was widespread. Settlements were larger and more permanent. Monumental building projects flourished. Trade networks spanned continents. Ritual traditions blossomed. Stone, brick, and ceramic technologies were well established. And yet for all this, the earliest years of many of the world's most influential civilizations begin in partial darkness, as if their roots were deliberately obscured by time itself. Cities appear in the archaeological record with a level of sophistication that implies centuries of development we cannot yet trace. Scripts emerge fully formed. Bureaucracies materialize with structures too refined to have been invented overnight. This is not the silence of the Middle Holocene, where organic materials simply failed to preserve. This is a deeper kind of silence, one wrapped in hints of organization and complexity that did not emerge from nowhere. Something was happening in the centuries before the dawn of writing that shaped the destinies of entire regions, yet the physical evidence of these transformations is scattered, faint, or lost beneath the sediment of later urban layers. Consider ancient Mesopotamia, long regarded as the cradle of civilization. When we examine the earliest cities, Uruk, Eridu, Kish, we find them already possessing monumental architecture, administrative tokens, irrigation systems, social stratification, and religious iconography. The famous Uruk expansion, long debated among scholars, shows cultural influence spreading rapidly across enormous distances. But the steps that led to this explosion of complexity remain unclear. Beneath the earliest monumental layers lie smaller, more modest structures, traces of earlier communities, but these too do not extend back far enough to explain the sophistication that emerges. There must have been centuries of experimentation in governance, ritual, craft specialization, and urban planning, yet these formative layers remain elusive. Egypt, too, presents a strange silence. By the time the earliest dynasties appear, With hieroglyphic writing, stone mastabas, taxation systems, royal iconography, the cultural foundation is already astonishingly mature. It is as though the state emerged with ready-made ideological and administrative frameworks. Yet the pre-dynastic cemeteries and settlements that precede this moment preserve only fragments, ornaments, pottery, early palette carvings that hint at complex traditions but do not illuminate the bridge to full civilization. The Nile's annual floods, so central to Egyptian life, also erased countless early habitations. Settlements built on floodplains vanished under centuries of silt. Thus, the earliest pharaohs stand like monuments rising out of a fog. Present, powerful, yet without the visible developmental arc we expect. In the Indus Valley, the pattern is even more mysterious. By the time the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro reached their height, they already possessed grid planning, drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and long-distance trade networks linking them to Mesopotamia. But the earliest phases of this urban tradition remain poorly preserved. Floods, shifting river courses, and the sheer scale of the Indus Basin obscured settlement layers older than the major cities. As a result, one of the world's most sophisticated early civilizations remains strangely detached from its roots, floating above an archaeological gap we cannot fully bridge. China's earliest dynasties show similar problems. The Erlitou culture, often associated with the legendary Xia dynasty, appears with palatial structures, bronze metallurgy, and complex political systems seemingly already in place. Yet the proto-urban settlements that preceded it are still being found in fragments, their development harder to trace than expected. The origins of bronze technology in this region remain debated. Its earliest forms appear suddenly with advanced craftsmanship rather than slowly evolving prototypes. Across the Americas, the pattern repeats. The Norte Chico civilization of Peru built massive platform mounds and ceremonial complexes thousands of years ago, but its early development remains partially hidden beneath later construction or lost to coastal erosion. Mesoamerican societies erected monumental earthen pyramids long before the first Olmec stone heads appeared, yet the details of their social organization remain unclear. Even later, megalithic complexes, enigmatic cities of stone perched in the Andes or hidden beneath the jungles of Central America, testify to cultural traditions whose earliest stages lie concealed. It is as though across continents, the late Holocene world was preparing for something, testing, experimenting, refining, and the archaeological traces of these preparations lie mostly beyond our reach. This silence is not a void. It is full of implications. It suggests that human complexity did not arrive suddenly, did not burst into existence with the invention of writing or the rise of kings. Instead, complexity brewed in the centuries before the historical record, in societies whose early forms either dissolved under the weight of later construction, eroded beneath shifting climates, or were built with perishable materials that left only whispers behind. The late Holocene also witnessed dramatic environmental changes, shifts that reshaped human settlement patterns and may have erased entire cultural landscapes. Around 4,200 years ago, a major climatic event occurred, the 4.2 kilo-year aridification episode. Lakes dried, rivers shrank, monsoons weakened. Entire regions experienced prolonged drought. This event coincides with major societal shifts: the decline of the Akkadian Empire, disruptions in Old Kingdom Egypt, transformations in the Indus Valley, and changes across early Chinese cultures. Yet the precise mechanisms linking climate and societal change remain murky. Erosion, abandonment, migration all contribute to the archaeological absences we now struggle to interpret. These absences shape our perception of the late Holocene. They make some societies appear more sudden than they were, more miraculous in their emergence, more isolated in their innovation. But in reality, innovations likely flowed across networks we can no longer trace. Technologies that appear in one region may have had prototypes elsewhere. Ritual forms may have developed over centuries before monumental expression. Social hierarchies may have emerged gradually before leaving visible traces. One of the most striking aspects of this era is the emergence of long-distance exchange networks that predate writing. Obsidian from Anatolia appears in the Levant. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan travels to Mesopotamia. Jade from southern China moves across Southeast Asia. Shell beads travel across the Indian Ocean. Amber moves from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. These exchanges imply navigational knowledge, trade agreements, shared values, and economic systems robust enough to maintain interregional connections. But the administrative tools, tallies, proto-contracts, ritualized exchange customs, have mostly vanished. Without writing, these systems operated on memory, tradition, and kinship, leaving behind only the objects themselves. Equally mysterious is the emergence of standardized architecture. Rectangular houses appear across cultures at roughly similar times. Storage facilities become more uniform. Ceremonial structures adopt repeating forms. This suggests communication, not isolation. But we cannot yet reconstruct the full pathways through which ideas spread. Were they transmitted by seasonal gatherings, trade expeditions, migrating artisans, ritual specialists who traveled between communities? The evidence is insufficient to say, and then, nearly everywhere, writing suddenly emerges, not as crude symbols, not as tentative experiments, but as fully functional systems. Cuneiform appears with its signs already representing syllables and words. Egyptian hieroglyphs begin with elaborately formed symbols. The Indus script appears with standardized signs across a wide region. Chinese oracle bone inscriptions show sophisticated structure from the outset. Linear Elamite, Proto-Elamite, and the early Cretan scripts appear with complexity rather than simplicity. This abruptness is an illusion created by the absence of earlier stages. There must have been centuries of experimentation, trial and error, ephemeral scripts written on wood or cloth or clay that have not survived. These early scripts may have been used in trade, ritual, or taxation before becoming formalized. But in the archaeological record, writing appears fully grown, a tool without its prototypes. The silence surrounding early writing is mirrored by the silence surrounding early governance. When kings and rulers first appear in the record, they already command armies, extract tribute, and oversee monumental construction. Their authority seems absolute, their institutions stable. But states do not arise fully formed. They emerge from social contracts, negotiations, conflicts, and alliances that rarely leave durable traces. By the time writing illuminates these structures, their roots are already centuries deep. This deep-rootedness extends to religion as well. The earliest recorded myths, Sumerian cosmogonies, Egyptian creation narratives, Proto-Vedic hymns, are too sophisticated to be first inventions. They reflect generations of oral tradition already lost. Rituals depicted in early temples must have had prototypes in earlier shrines that used wood rather than stone. Priestly classes must have existed long before their roles were codified. But without written accounts, these origins remain invisible. The late Holocene also witnessed profound demographic changes, population growth, urbanization, and increasing social complexity. Yet evidence of early urban life is often overwritten by later phases of construction. Early houses lie beneath later temples. Early roads lie beneath fortified city gates. Early trash disposal systems lie beneath administrative quarters. Archaeologists excavate downward through layers of civilization, but the deepest layers are often the most degraded, pieced together from fragments. All of this contributes to an uncanny sensation, the sense that history begins already in motion, as though we are joining a play long after the first act ended. The earliest inscriptions introduce kings whose genealogies stretch into unrecorded pasts. The earliest cities show signs of planning that imply earlier, unseen prototypes. The earliest metallurgists refine techniques that must have arisen through generations of practice. The late Holocene is thus a threshold, a liminal space between prehistory and history, where the world is full, vibrant, interconnected, yet still veiled. The silence of this period is not emptiness, it is density. A density of activity, experimentation, migration, innovation, and cultural flowering so vast that only small, durable fragments survive. And these fragments, the monuments, the pottery, the bones, the metals, the early scripts, speak of a world that was already old by the time history began recording it. A world of forgotten kingdoms, vanished priesthoods, migrations that left no names, technologies that evolved in workshops now buried beneath cities. We live in the shadow of that world. Its silence shapes our understanding of our beginnings. Its absences remind us that what we call the dawn of civilization was not a beginning at all, but an unveiling of structures long prepared in hidden centuries. And the late Holocene, with its echoes and gaps, remains one of the most profound reminders that history does not reveal everything. It reveals only what survives. And most of what shaped us lies beneath that surface, waiting, concealed in the dark. By the time the ancient world crossed fully into the Bronze Age, an era illuminated by metal, myth, trade, kingship, and the earliest written chronicles, the archaeological and historical records should, in theory, deliver full clarity. Cities stood tall, armies marched, merchants crossed mountains and seas, rulers carved their victories in stone, bureaucracies tracked grain, livestock, labor, and tribute. This was the age when memory should have sharpened, when the past should cease to be elusive. And yet, in a twist both startling and familiar, the Bronze Age presents some of the deepest, most bewildering mysteries in the entire human saga. For even in this era of supposed transparency, vast chapters of human experience remain invisible, broken, or warped by fire and collapse. Cultures rose with astonishing sophistication, only to vanish without leaving a clear trail. Writing systems appeared, flourished, and disappeared into undeciphered silence. Powerful kingdoms emerged on landscapes whose origins remain uncertain. Trade networks spanned thousands of miles, yet the mechanisms behind them, the ships, the alliances, the navigational knowledge, remain faintly understood. And at the center of it all lies a cataclysm so profound the late Bronze Age collapse, that it still defies full explanation. A collapse that shattered nearly every major civilization of its time, plunged regions into centuries-long darkness, erased scripts, ended dynasties, and rearranged the human world in ways that would echo for millennia. But to understand that collapse, we must first examine the strange nature of the Bronze Age itself, an era defined by brilliance and fragility in equal measure. Imagine the world around 2300 to 1200 BCE. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant, the Indus Basin, the Aegean, and parts of China, sophisticated societies flourished. These were not mere chiefdoms, but fully realized civilizations. They built palaces, temples, and administrative complexes. They fielded professional armies. They produced art, metallurgy, mathematics, astronomy, and monumental architecture. They tracked time through lunisolar calendars. They maintained diplomatic relations using formal letters, emissaries, and political marriages. Yet despite all this sophistication, much of the Bronze Age world rested upon an extremely delicate foundation. Metallurgical knowledge dependent on complex supply chains, agricultural systems vulnerable to climatic shifts, and political structures reliant on elite networks that could falter quickly if disrupted. Beneath the grandeur lay fragility. Beneath the monuments lay instability. One of the greatest puzzles of the Bronze Age is the sudden appearance of highly advanced urban centers with little archaeological preamble. In the Aegean, the Minoan civilization constructed palace complexes, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, with labyrinthine architecture, advanced plumbing, storerooms for vast quantities of goods, frescoes of extraordinary beauty, and administrative tools, including the still undeciphered Linear A script. Yet the early developmental stages of Minoan society remain obscure. Their origins, maritime expansion, and religious traditions lack the clear evolutionary trail expected of a major power. Similarly, the Mycenaean Greeks appear with citadels, monumental tombs, chariot warfare, metallurgy, and a writing system, Linear B, that reveals an administrative complexity rivaling later classical states. But the route through which these early Greek cultures developed remains underexplored, buried beneath later rebuilding phases. The jump from early Bronze Age villages to palace-centered political structures appears faster, more decisive, and more mysterious than existing evidence explains. In Egypt, the Middle and New Kingdoms project an image of stability and continuity, yet the Second Intermediate Period and the transition into the New Kingdom reveal a far more turbulent story, one involving foreign rule, migrations, shifting alliances, and technological innovations whose origins are not fully documented. Even Egypt, with its iconic monumental architecture, preserves massive gaps in our understanding of local life, early settlement organization, and the regional interactions that shaped its development. Mesopotamia's archives are even more fragmented. Cities like Mari, Ebla, and Ur preserved extraordinary records when their palaces burned, clay tablets hardened by accidental fire. But countless other cities left no such archive, their administrative documents dissolved by water or crushed by later construction. The earliest phases of Akkadian and Babylonian culture remain murky. Sumerian origins remain speculative, reconstructed from later myths and scattered archaeological data. The early evolution of cuneiform, the world's first known writing system, remains partly theoretical, with missing centuries that would illuminate the transition from symbolic tokens to fully formed script. Then there are the civilizations that remain largely unknown. The Indus Valley Civilization, with its meticulously planned cities, sewage systems, grid layouts, and standardized weights, left behind tens of thousands of inscribed objects, yet their script is still undeciphered. Without access to their words, we cannot hear their stories. We cannot trace their political structures, religious beliefs, or economic systems. Their collapse remains enigmatic. Their origins remain debated. The civilization that once rivaled Egypt and Mesopotamia now speaks through silence. This silence grows even deeper when we consider the civilizations of the Eurasian steppes. Horse herders, metallurgists, and early chariot users forged networks that stretched from the Black Sea to Mongolia. Their influence shaped Indo-European languages, warfare, pastoralism, and long-distance trade. Yet their settlements were often ephemeral, their material culture perishable, and their burial mounds selectively preserved. The earliest forms of mounted warfare, the spread of chariot technology, and the transmission of ritual traditions across the steppes remain incompletely understood. And then we encounter perhaps the most startling dimension of the Bronze Age, its global connectivity. Amber from the Baltic appears in Mycenaean tombs. Tin from Central Asia moves into the Mediterranean. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan lies in Egyptian jewelry. Mesopotamian cylinder seals depict imagery from distant lands. Egyptian inscriptions mention peoples from the Aegean, Anatolia, and beyond. Ships carried cargoes across the Mediterranean, long before the era of classical seafaring. Yet the navigational tools, shipbuilding techniques, and maritime trade networks that supported this system remain largely hidden. Wooden ships rarely survive. Ropes, sails, and navigation instruments vanish quickly unless buried in special environments. Thus, we know these networks existed, but not how they functioned. And into this world of brilliance and mystery came disaster. The late Bronze Age collapse, roughly 1200 BCE, remains one of the most dramatic turning points in human history. Within a century, nearly every major civilization of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East fell. Mycenaean palaces burned. The Hittite Empire vanished. Cities across the Levant were abandoned. Egypt faced invasions and internal upheaval. Trade networks disintegrated. Writing systems disappeared. The Bronze Age world, with its kings, diplomats, merchants, and warriors, dissolved. Theories abound: climate change, drought, famine, earthquakes, invasions, internal rebellions, epidemics, technological shifts. Some argue the Sea Peoples, a confederation of migrating groups, ravaged coastal cities. Others argue systemic collapse, where the interdependence of states became a fatal vulnerability. Others still point to a perfect storm: drought weakening agriculture, trade disruptions causing shortages, political instability creating vacuum, migrations triggered by famine or climate stress. But the truth remains elusive because the archaeological record is incomplete. Burn layers survive, but administrative records do not. Skeletons appear, but their origins and identities remain uncertain. Weapons scatter across abandoned citadels, but the contexts of their use are unclear. Even the Sea Peoples, so infamous in Egyptian inscriptions, remain culturally undefined. Their material culture, homelands, and political ambitions remain ghostly, visible only as a destructive force, not as a clearly traced civilization. And after the collapse, even more confusion. Across the Mediterranean, centuries of darkness followed. Many regions saw population decline. Writing systems disappeared, only to reappear later in different forms. Monumental architecture ceased for generations. Pottery styles shifted dramatically. Societies reorganized into smaller, more localized communities. Yet in some places, Phoenicia, early Israel, Cyprus, new cultures emerged quickly, drawing from older traditions in ways not yet fully understood. This fragmentation extended beyond the Mediterranean. In South Asia, the Indus Valley collapse led to centuries of cultural reorganization. In China, the transition between the Xia, Shang, and Zhou periods involved migrations, warfare, and cultural blending that the archaeological record only partially captures. In the Americas, early Andean polities rose and fell without written records to explain why. One of the most striking features of the post-collapse world is the reemergence of writing. In the Aegean, Linear B disappeared, replaced centuries later by the Greek alphabet. In the Levant, Proto-Canaanite scripts evolved into Phoenician writing, eventually spreading across the Mediterranean and forming the foundation for Greek and Latin alphabets. In the Near East, cuneiform persisted, but diminished. In South Asia, early scripts emerged anew. This suggests something remarkable. Writing was not a one-time invention, but a cultural tool that societies repeatedly reinvented or revitalized when needed. The silence that followed the Bronze Age collapse was not the end of literacy. It was a pause, a resetting, a return to simpler forms of social organization before complexity surged again. And in that resetting lies one of the greatest mysteries of the Bronze Age. Why so many societies forgot so much so quickly? Scripts vanished, technologies disappeared, diplomatic relationships dissolved, monumental architecture halted. It is as if the collapse did not simply destroy cities, it severed cultural memory. This phenomenon echoes across many early civilizations. The Maya experienced multiple collapses. China saw dynastic transitions accompanied by loss of knowledge. Mesopotamia endured cycles of destruction and rediscovery. Cultural memory, it seems, can be as fragile as the materials used to record it. And yet, in the centuries following the Bronze Age collapse, something extraordinary happened. Across multiple continents, nearly simultaneously, new cultural forms emerged. The Iron Age dawned. Alphabetic writing spread. New empires formed: Assyria, Neo-Babylonia, Persia. Philosophical traditions began to take shape in Greece, India, and China. Trade networks revived. Urbanism resurged. Humanity reinvented itself. But the roots of this reinvention lie in the shadows of the Bronze Age. Shadows that hold both brilliance and catastrophe. Shadows filled with undeciphered scripts, forgotten cities, unrecorded migrations, vanished technologies, and destroyed archives. The absence is not emptiness, it is loss, a loss that forces us to reconstruct one of the most pivotal eras in human history, from fragments scattered across burned palaces, drowned coastlines, collapsed temples, and buried storerooms. The Bronze Age reminds us that even in eras of writing and monumental building, history can evaporate. The stories that survived did so because they were carved into stone or preserved accidentally. The vast majority, ordinary lives, daily rituals, common technologies, unwritten laws, diplomatic nuances, scientific knowledge, vanished in fire and flood. And so the Bronze Age stands before us not as a clear window into the past, but as a cracked mirror, reflecting brilliance, fragility, innovation, and destruction, yet offering only partial images of the civilizations that shaped the world that came after. It is a reminder that even the brightest eras can fall into darkness, and that humanity's story, no matter how powerful or advanced, remains vulnerable to the erasing hand of time. By the time the world emerged from the ruins of the late Bronze Age collapse, humanity stood on the threshold of something altogether new, a world defined not only by rebuilding, but by reinvention. The centuries that followed were an age of recollection and forgetting, an age when old knowledge flickered faintly in ritual stories and fading oral traditions, even as entirely new frameworks of thought began crystallizing in distant corners of the earth. This was the age when the great Iron Age civilizations stirred, when philosophies took root, when alphabets spread, when empires consolidated, and when human identity, spiritual, political, intellectual, underwent a transformation so profound that nearly every modern tradition traces its ancestry back to this turbulent span of time. And yet, for all its historical density, the early Iron Age remains a wilderness of missing pages. It is the strange hinge between the anonymous ancient world and the beginnings of recognizable history. Archaeology fills some gaps. Early kings left inscriptions, merchants carved trade records, ritual specialists codified fragments of myth. But the overwhelming majority of people, their struggles, experiments, migrations, ideas, remain ghost-like, implied only by the structures they built or the ruins left behind. This is the paradox of the early Iron Age. It is both the moment when humanity finally steps into clearer historical illumination, and the moment when we realize how much was lost in the collapses that preceded it. Great traditions survived only in fragments. Languages died out. Scripts disappeared. Entire branches of cultural evolution severed. The world that rose after the collapse was unmistakably new, yet deeply haunted by the quiet absence of what had come before. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, imagine standing in the eastern Mediterranean around 900 BCE. Not long ago, this region was dominated by sprawling Bronze Age kingdoms: Mycenae, Hatti, Ugarit, Cyprus, Canaan, Kassite Babylonia. Their palaces glittered with trade goods from across the known world. Their scribes kept thousands of clay tablets. Their ships crossed seas in coordinated, large-scale networks. Their weapons, rituals, and technologies showed refinement built over centuries. Then, in the span of only a few generations, nearly all of them burned, crumbled, or emptied. The infrastructures that sustained their world collapsed. Now, in the early Iron Age, something different appears in their place. Smaller, decentralized settlements, new ethnic identities, emerging languages, reorganized trade networks, and, most crucially, new forms of social order that did not mirror the vertical hierarchies of the Bronze Age kingdoms. In Greece, for example, the collapse gave birth to a world of small communities whose decentralized structure laid the foundation for later civic experiments. In the Levant, seafaring peoples, the Phoenicians, rose into prominence by mastering trade routes abandoned during the collapse. Across Canaan, early Israelite communities emerged not as a single conquering force, but as a mosaic of hilltop settlements gradually developing a cultural identity distinct from neighboring peoples. Meanwhile, in the deserts beyond Mesopotamia, the Arameans moved across lands once held by larger empires, forming networks of towns and city-states whose languages would influence the region for centuries. In Mesopotamia itself, Assyria began consolidating power once more, learning from the mistakes of earlier collapses and forging administrative strategies that would define imperial rule for generations. The shift into the Iron Age was not just political, it was technological. Iron, abundant but difficult to smelt, gradually replaced bronze in weapons and tools. This transition was not abrupt. Early iron was brittle, inconsistent, and often inferior to bronze. But with time, ironworking techniques improved. As iron became widespread, the economic balance shifted dramatically. Societies no longer depended on rare tin sources scattered across distant mountain ranges. Metal became more accessible. Weapons became more abundant. Tools reached more households. The everyday experience of farming, building, and crafting changed as metal technology democratized. And yet the spread of iron also brought new vulnerabilities. When weapons became easier to produce, conflict became more diffuse. Raiders no longer needed to rely on bronze specialists. Warfare shifted from elite chariot forces to mass infantry. The military landscape became more unpredictable. Regions that once relied on palace-centered defense strategies struggled to adapt. Societies that adapted quickly survived. Those that did not faded. But beyond warfare and politics, the Iron Age sparked an intellectual flowering unlike anything before. The earliest forms of Greek philosophical inquiry began taking shape from oral traditions still echoing from the collapse. In India, the compositions of the Vedas began crystallizing into codified ritual and cosmic speculation. In China, the early Zhou period planted the seeds of later philosophical systems, ideas that would become Confucianism, Taoism, and other schools of thought. In the Near East, prophetic traditions emerged, carrying messages of justice, identity, and divine order that would later shape global religions. These intellectual revolutions did not arise from stillness. They arose from instability. In times of upheaval, societies ask deeper questions. Old explanations fail. Old gods falter. Old systems crumble. The Iron Age became a crucible for new ways of understanding existence. And yet, for all the intellectual ferment of this time, the earliest writings describing these shifts remain partial, layered atop centuries of oral tradition. The first prophets, philosophers, poets, and chroniclers did not invent new ideas. They captured the residue of generations whose voices did not survive. Across the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians achieved something extraordinary. They simplified writing. Instead of complex syllabaries or logographic systems, they distilled language into a set of alphabetic symbols representing sounds. This innovation, seemingly modest, would transform the world. The Greek alphabet emerged from Phoenician roots. From Greek came Latin. From Latin came countless scripts used today. The spread of the alphabet democratized writing, reducing the learning barrier, allowing merchants, sailors, artisans, and eventually entire societies to access literacy. Yet the earliest stages of alphabetic adoption are poorly documented. We see the results, but not the conversations, experiments, or teaching methods that carried the alphabet from one culture to another. This same pattern, clear outcome, obscure origin, repeats across the Iron Age. Take urban revival. Cities revived after the Bronze Age collapse did not simply rebuild the past, they invented new forms of urban life. Greek city-states developed agora-based civic systems. Phoenician cities forged maritime economies. Neo-Hittite states fused local and inherited traditions, but these forms emerge suddenly in the archaeological record. Where were the transitional settlements? Where were the proto-agoras, the early sanctuaries, the experimental governance structures? Many remain buried beneath modern cities, destroyed by later building, or were never constructed with durable materials. Even more mysterious is the spread of large-scale religious traditions. In the Levant, early Israelite religion evolved from Canaanite roots, yet the archaeological record does not fully reveal how household rituals transformed into centralized worship. In Greece, mystery cults, heroic narratives, and temple traditions emerged from pre-existing mythic structures, but without clear developmental phases preserved. In India, early Vedic ritual evolved into philosophical reflection and ascetic practice, yet the earliest stages of these transitions lie in oral poetry rather than archaeological sites. The Iron Age also witnessed dramatic population movements that continue to shape the world today. Indo-European languages spread across Europe. The Iranian-speaking peoples expanded across Central Asia and the Near East. Celtic groups moved into Western Europe. Germanic groups began forming distinct identities. Yet the exact routes, interactions, and social dynamics behind these dispersals remain unclear. Burial sites tell only part of the story. Pottery styles hint at connections, but not motivations. Ancient DNA offers new insights, but still cannot capture the lived experience of migration. And then, scattered across the world in the early Iron Age, we find moments of extraordinary creativity, moments that suggest intense experimentation in art, metallurgy, architecture, and governance. The geometric pottery of Greece, the bronze casting traditions of the Zhou, the monumental earthworks of the Americas, the rock-cut temples of the Arabian Peninsula, the sculptures of the Nok culture in West Africa, the megalithic traditions of the British Isles transitioning into new ceremonial forms. These scattered traditions tell us that innovation was not centralized. It was global. But the pathways that carried ideas from one region to another, if they existed, remain obscure. Were there lost trade routes, shared mythic frameworks, traveling artisans, diplomatic envoys whose accounts were never written or have long since vanished? The material record alone cannot answer. And then comes the shadow that defines the Iron Age more than anything else: the absence of voices. Even though writing existed, even though some societies kept records, the vast majority of people, farmers, traders, soldiers, craftsmen, mothers, travelers, wanderers, left no written trace. Their beliefs, choices, and strategies of survival must be inferred through tools, settlement patterns, and art. Written chronicles mostly reflect elite concerns: wars, taxes, rituals, lineages, divine favor. The Iron Age is full of people, yet their humanity must be reconstructed from material scraps. But amid this vast silence, something fundamental changes. The Iron Age marks the moment when memory begins to attach itself to specific events. When kings commemorate battles, when temples receive endowments recorded in inscriptions, when genealogies matter, when boundaries harden, when identity becomes tied to land, language, and belief. What had once been fluid, tribes dissolving and reforming, cultures blending without record, now begins to crystallize. The world transitions from a patchwork of shifting groups into recognizable nations and cultures with enduring traditions. Still, this transition leaves behind profound mysteries. Why did some scripts survive while others vanished? Why did certain philosophies flourish while others faded without trace? Why did some societies rebuild quickly after collapse, while others remained in fragmentation for centuries? Even today, as archaeologists uncover new sites, from submerged Bronze Age harbors to desert fortresses to woodland sanctuaries, the Iron Age refuses to yield a single, coherent narrative. Instead, it offers a mosaic, brilliant, fractured, incomplete, a world where the boundaries between myth and history blur, where oral traditions hold echoes of forgotten migrations, where the earliest recorded texts describe a world already ancient, already shaped by forces we can only partially reconstruct. The Iron Age is not merely a bridge between antiquity and classical civilization. It is a crucible, a furnace where the cultural, political, and spiritual foundations of the modern world were forged. Yet those foundations rest upon strata of lost memory. Beneath every surviving text lies an older, unwritten story. Beneath every temple lies an older sanctuary built of wood or clay. Beneath every kingdom lies an older tribe whose name we do not know. This is the profound truth of the Iron Age. It is the first chapter of recognizable history, but it is also the last chapter of mystery, a world where human intentions become more visible, but human origins remain hidden, a world where continuity meets rupture, a world that feels both familiar and unreachable. And as we approach the final turn in humanity's long, ancient journey, we begin to sense that even the clarity we believe we possess is only partial. A thin layer of illumination laid atop an ocean of forgotten beginnings. By the time the world crossed into the late Iron Age and approached what historians comfortably call antiquity, the foundations of human civilization appeared firm. Cities rose with stone walls and marble colonnades. Scripts evolved into literary traditions. Laws became codified. Empires stretched across continents. Philosophy deepened. Mathematics and astronomy advanced, and religions began to crystallize into forms still recognizable today. It was an age that seemed to stand on solid ground. A world finally illuminated by writing, memory, and monumental ambition. But beneath this clarity lies an unsettling truth. Even in the late Iron Age, even in the era of recognizable history, enormous gaps persist. The more we study the origins of classical civilizations, Greece, Rome, Persia, India, China, the more we realize how many of their foundations rest upon layers of myth, oral tradition, and vanished cultural strata. Every pillar of the ancient world, no matter how carefully carved or meticulously recorded, sits atop a deep well of forgotten origins. And as archaeology continues to peel back the layers, the late Iron Age reveals itself not as the end of prehistory, but as the final threshold, a liminal zone between the submerged continents of the ancient past and the illuminated shorelines of recorded history. To understand this threshold, imagine the world around 500 BCE. Across the Mediterranean, Greek city-states flourish. Democracy, philosophy, theater, and rational inquiry begin weaving new intellectual frameworks. Yet the Mycenaean world that preceded them, its palaces, scripts, bureaucracies, collapsed centuries earlier, leaving only faint echoes in myth. The Homeric epics, transmitted orally before being written down, describe a heroic age filtered through generations of retelling. Archaeology reveals fragments, burned walls, burial goods, linear B tablets, but the cultural transition from Mycenaean palatial states to classical Greek city-states is still veiled. The Iron Age period between these worlds the so-called Greek Dark Age, remains one of the most poorly understood transitions in ancient history. In Italy, early Rome emerges from a similar haze. The city's official histories, written centuries after its founding, blend mythology with political memory. The archaeological record shows settlements on the Palatine Hill, early trade connections, ritual sites, but the first centuries of Roman development remain foggy. Rome's later legal codes, imperial strategies, and architectural brilliance rest on roots that remain murky even to experts. We can see the tree. The seed remains buried. In Persia, the Achaemenid Empire rises with sudden clarity. Great kings, monumental palaces, royal inscriptions carved into mountainsides. Yet the origins of Persia's religious and philosophical traditions remain elusive. Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic frameworks, preserves hymns that may stretch back millennia, but the earliest stages of this religious tradition lie in oral poetry, whose origins are impossible to date. The behaviors, rituals, and migrations of the early Iranian peoples, crucial to understanding Persian identity, remain scattered across burial mounds and partially reconstructed linguistic data. In India, the Vedic tradition evolves into rich philosophical systems. The Upanishads, the early schools of thought, the beginnings of what would later become Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism. Yet the Vedic people themselves, their migrations, settlements, political structures, are only partially recoverable. Their earliest hymns circulated orally for centuries before being written down, and the archaeological signatures of their earliest societies do not align neatly with later literary memory. We know the broad strokes, the fine details have dissolved. In China, the late Iron Age witnessed the Spring and Autumn and Warring States periods, eras of remarkable intellectual innovation. Confucius, Laozi, Mozi, and many other thinkers articulated ideas that would shape civilization for thousands of years. Yet the origins of the Zhou dynasty, the earlier Shang state, and the prehistoric cultures that preceded them contain major uncertainties. The earliest Chinese writing survives on oracle bones, but reflects a worldview already mature, built upon traditions whose emergence cannot yet be fully traced. Even in regions without writing, the late Iron Age shows brilliance and ambiguity in equal measure. Celtic societies in Europe built hill forts, created intricate metalwork, maintained elaborate rituals, yet left minimal written accounts. Their migrations, social hierarchies, and religious systems must be inferred through material culture. In sub-Saharan Africa, early Iron Age societies expanded with advanced metallurgy and agriculture, but their political and ritual structures remain partially hidden due to the perishable nature of their environments. In the Americas, civilizations such as the Olmec, Chavin, Zapotec, and later early Maya developed monumental architecture and artistic traditions, yet their earliest stages remain buried beneath later layers of development. This global fog of origins raises a profound question. Why does so much of humanity's ancient story remain invisible even in eras where literacy existed, where monumental structures dominated landscapes, where long-distance trade networks flourished? The answer lies in three forces that shaped the visibility of history: material fragility, cultural reconfiguration, and the selective nature of recorded memory. Material fragility is perhaps the most straightforward. Papyrus decays. Bark scrolls disintegrate. Ink dissolves. Houses built of timber collapse within decades unless fossilized by accident. Road systems disappear when abandoned. The vast majority of written and material culture in the late Iron Age was still produced in forms that did not endure. Only objects preserved in unique conditions, dry deserts, sealed tombs, clay tablets baked in fire, survived. Cultural reconfiguration is more subtle, but equally powerful. When empires rise, they often redefine identity, rewrite narratives, reorganize cities, and suppress or absorb earlier traditions. The Assyrians absorbed the Arameans, the Persians absorbed the Medes, the Greeks absorbed Minoan legacies, the Romans absorbed Etruscan practices. In every case, earlier identities faded, rituals changed, scripts fell out of use, languages evolved or died. The Iron Age is filled with cultural erasures, not always violent, but transformative. These erasures hide the earliest phases of many classical traditions. And then there is selective memory. Written chronicles rarely record ordinary life. They do not tell us how farmers adapted to climate change, how artisans learned new techniques, how healers experimented with early forms of medicine, how travelers crossed mountains, deserts, and oceans. They focus on wars, kings, treaties, elite rituals. Thus, entire dimensions of human experience remain invisible. This invisibility becomes especially pronounced when we look at the spiritual revolutions of the late Iron Age. Nearly every major religious or philosophical tradition, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, early Greek philosophy, Confucianism, Taoism, took shape during this period. Yet their earliest practitioners remain anonymous. The teachers who shaped the first rituals, the communities who preserved oral teachings, the storytellers who carried traditions across generations, all remain unseen. We see the doctrines after they were codified, not the centuries of experimentation behind them. Equally enigmatic is the explosion of written literature. In Greece, Homeric poetry emerges, but the lineage of oral tradition behind it remains uncertain. In India, the Upanishads reinterpret the Vedas but draw on earlier oral structures. In Israel, prophetic writings reflect centuries of earlier mythic and ritual development. In China, the Analects preserve conversations that may echo a much broader, earlier intellectual landscape. This is the strange duality of the late Iron Age. It is a world overflowing with documents, inscriptions, architecture, and material culture, yet one also profoundly shaped by absences. We know the names of kings, but not the full structure of their societies. We know the texts of philosophers, but not the formative debates that shaped their ideas. We know the rituals of states, but not the household practices of ordinary families. We know the roots of armies, but not the roots of traders who quietly connected the world. To see this more clearly, consider the rise of Rome. The Roman Republic appears with institutions, the Senate, consuls, assemblies, that seem too sophisticated to have sprung fully formed. These political structures must have evolved gradually, shaped by early conflicts, reform movements, and experiments in governance. Yet the earliest phases of Roman political history are reconstructed from later accounts that blend fact and legend. The archaeology of early Rome reveals huts, boundary ditches, and early temples, but the evolution of its political identity remains a shadow. Or consider Greece. The transition from the Mycenaean kingdoms to the polis system is still not fully understood. The polis, a community that merged political, social, religious, and military identity, has no clear predecessor in the Bronze Age. The prototype must have existed in the centuries after the collapse, in the era of small villages and emerging aristocracies. But the material record does not describe how councils formed, how laws emerged, or how communal identity solidified. We have the outcome, but not the process. In China, early states consolidated into vast bureaucratic empires during the late Iron Age, but the mechanisms of this consolidation remain partly hidden. Bronze ritual vessels depict ideology, oracle bones reveal divination, warring states' texts describe political theory, but the everyday workings of early administrations, the unrecorded disputes, the local traditions absorbed or replaced, remain obscure. In India, the shift from tribal assemblies to early states involved complex interactions among pastoral groups, agricultural communities, and urban centers. The archaeological record shows fortified settlements, craft specialization, trade networks, but the political processes behind the earliest kingdoms remain uncertain. The Americas present an even deeper silence. Civilizations such as the Zapotec, Chavin, and early Maya had writing or proto-writing systems, monumental architecture, complex rituals, and trade networks. Yet their origin stories are fragmented. Many early inscriptions remain undeciphered. Entire phases of cultural development lie buried beneath later cities or eroded away. The late Iron Age, for all its apparent illumination, still feels like a world whose foundations we glimpse only in silhouette. It is the age when the engine of civilization revs fully, but the blueprint remains partly hidden. Yet this very ambiguity gives the late Iron Age its unique power. It is the final chapter of humanity's deep prehistory, the last moment when most of the world's story lies just beyond our reach. After this era, writing proliferates, archives expand, and history becomes increasingly traceable. But in the late Iron Age, the ancient past still breathes through myth, ritual, and material fragments, rather than through comprehensive records. And this is perhaps the most important realization. Humanity did not emerge into classical civilization suddenly, nor through a clean break from the past. Every innovation of the Iron Age, writing, philosophy, statecraft, religion, mathematics, navigation, rests upon foundations laid long before in centuries whose traces are faint. The Iron Age is the hinge, but the door it swings open reveals a landscape built by thousands of anonymous ancestors whose names we will never know. It reminds us that even at the moment when history begins, we are still standing in twilight. Behind us lies an ocean of vanished worlds. Ahead lies the documented history of empires, conquests, inventions, and transformations. But between these two realms is a narrow, luminous band, the late Iron Age, where shadows and light mingle. A world where we can finally read the names of kings, but not the origins of their crowns. Where we can hear the teachings of sages, but not the early voices that shaped their thought. Where we can map the routes of armies, but not the forgotten paths of migrants. Where we can see the foundations of temples, but not the beliefs that predated them. The late Iron Age is the dawn before sunrise. Light has returned, but the horizon is still blurred. It is the moment just before the story becomes fully visible, when we realize how much of our identity, our myths, our systems of knowledge were forged in eras that left only scattered traces. And as we step from this twilight into the brightness of classical antiquity, we may feel the illusion that everything is now clear. But history is never so simple. Even in the well-documented civilizations that follow, loss continues. Libraries burn, chronicles distort, memories fade, civilizations rewrite their pasts. The story of humanity is not a straight line, but a tapestry, woven from threads that survive and threads that vanish. The Iron Age marks the moment when enough threads survived to suggest the pattern, but not enough to reveal it fully. And so we end our long journey across the deep past at the threshold of recorded history, not with certainty, but with humility. For every inscription carved in stone, there are 1,000 earlier stories carved in memory, now dissolved. For every temple that still stands, there were countless shrines of wood and earth lost to time. For every empire whose laws were written, there were generations of unwritten customs that shaped the world more deeply than any decree. The late Iron Age gives us just enough light to walk forward, but also enough shadow to remind us that mystery lies at the root of every civilization, every tradition, and every human life.